Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching.
The first men and women were hunters and nomads, awed and frightened by a world they did not understand. They invested great energy in rituals, sacrifices, temples, tombs, and with religion came gods and god-kings, magicians and priests, and the beginnings of a more complex society. The dawn of history this time on the Western tradition. I'm Eugene Ουέμπερ, and I teach history at UCLA, which is the University of California at Los Angeles. Today, I begin my personal journey through the history of Western civilization. I say personal because one man or one woman's view of history is not necessarily another's, as we shall see again and again during the next 52 programs. If you're wondering how we're going to cram several thousand years into 52 half hours, just remember that here in America we do everything very fast. For example, here is the history of the world in 4 minutes flat, just to get you in the mood. It's an excerpt from a film called Why Man Creates, by a creative man called Saul Bass.
Harry, do you realize you just invented the wheel?
I know.
Bronze, iron.
All was in chaos till Euclid arose and made order.
What is the good life? And how do you lead it?
Who shall rule the state?
The philosopher king.
The aristocrat.
The people.
You mean all the people? What is the nature of the good? What is the nature of justice?
What is happiness?
Hail Caesar! Roman law is now in session.
Allah be praised. I've invented the zero.
What?
Nothing.
What is the shape of the earth? Flat. What happens when you get to the edge? You fall off. Does the earth move? Never.
The earth moves.
The earth is round. The blood circulates. There are worlds smaller than ours.
There are worlds larger than ours.
Hey, what are you doing? I'm painting the ceiling. What are you doing? I'm painting the floor.
Says man is an animal.
Rot! Man is not an animal.
Animal.
Man isn't.
And he's an animal. Shall we start from the beginning?
I'm a bug, I'm a germ, I'm a bug, I'm a... Louis Pasteur. I'm not a bug, I'm not a germ, I'm not a bug.
Think it'll work, Alfred? Well, let's give it a try.
What do you think?
It worked. All men are created...
Life, liberty, and the pursuit...
Workers of the world, government of the people, by
the world must be made safe for democracy.
To end
a league of nations. I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed,
One world.
So now you know where we are headed, although I like to think it isn't as grim as all that. But where should we start? Perhaps the first thing to ask is what the scope of a series on the history of Western civilization should be. And the best way to think of it is that we are going back to the old country. We're going back to where many of our ancestors came from, to see where their stories came from, and their memories, and their habits, and the way they are, which has made us the way we are. This is what history is about, where we come from, what lies behind the way we live and act and think, how our institutions, our religions, our laws were made. And this is what I hope to do in this series, to go back to our origins. I know that all of us do not stem from the little peninsulas of Asia that we call Europe. But the language, the culture, the politics of the society we live in stem from there. And so it's an important journey for us to take from the very beginning. For our purposes, let's start about 60 million years ago, when the age of giant reptiles comes to an end. At that time, dinosaurs ruled. Mammals were cowering, timorous beasties that could never have challenged the superbly designed dinosaurs. And then, bang, a comet hits the Earth. The dinosaurs disappear, mammals get a chance to evolve, and among the mammals are the primates who tend to swing about in trees. Over 5 million years ago, one of these primate species, whose descendants made these footprints, one of these gets up on its hind legs. It doesn't make up its mind to go biped, but the less they hang about in trees, the more the primate's upper arms can be used to carry things. And the less they swing from trees, the longer their thumbs grow until they become opposable, which is convenient for grabbing and manipulating. And then, about 2 million years ago, these hands turn out a miracle, an artifact, a tool, something they had fashioned themselves. And this is when we are no longer speaking of apes, but of something recognizably human, in which a larger brain and manufactured stone tools go together. Like all primates, these beings close to human form, that we call hominids, did not have very good claws compared to a tiger, didn't have very good fangs compared to a wolf. But they found that if they wanted to grasp things, hands were superior to jaws. For example, with your hands, you can take a nut, you can put it on a stone, you can hit it with another stone, you can break it. Sometimes a stone would slip and chip the other stone, and God knows how many flints were chipped and flaked by mistake until one of these hominids actually saw what he had done and realized that he could do it again, and deliberately.
From that day on, primitive flint tools like these saved him from using his teeth for a lot of things. In the next 2 million years, he turned from vegetarian to carnivore, and the massive teeth made to chew on bark and grass and tubers, these teeth fined down. The powerful jaw muscles that imprisoned the skull relaxed. The brain that had been squeezed into the narrow skull began to expand. And this peculiar, thinking animal was engaged on the road of thought and of dental decay. It was only around 7000 BC that Stone Age people really learned to make fire by friction or by striking flints. Fire and thought together allowed hominids to expand into new habitats and ever more distant lands, even in times when glaciers like this one were pushing practically into the tropics, and our ancestors had to think or die. So they thought. And they quickly realized that thinking did not prevent death. Here, for the first time in the history of life, a creature makes the imaginative leap that lets it conceive its own end by looking at the end of a creature like it. To imagine my death from the death of someone like me, to feel diminished, mystified, terrified by death and by the dead. And to deal with corpses and their mystery and the terror they generated, man develops rituals, myths, religions, into which he invests an immense amount of energy. So that for millennia, a significant portion of the little surplus of what people grew and made went into tombs and temples like Stonehenge here. I can talk about these ruins because about 100,000 years ago, something that we can loosely call language, something like language developed. A new tool that allowed people to communicate meaningfully with one another. And then, in the new Stone Age, which is the age of Stonehenge, they also begin to devise primitive but revolutionary ways of storing information outside themselves by notches and markings and drawings, which means that now human beings could convey information not by word of mouth alone, but by signs, as we do in writing. Above all, these first men and women were hunters, gleaners, and nomads moving across the steppes and forests in small clans, following the animals and plants off which they fed. Most of the cave paintings we have found are obviously the work of artists who were part of a hunting society. Then, somewhere around 10 to 12,000 years ago, some of these people settled down, and we got an agricultural revolution, its origins as obscure as those of fire. When man discovered how to make the ground bear fruit, how to domesticate animals, how to store the product of his labors, he also developed a sense of property. And so structured societies grew up, with villages, wells, walls, slaves, and families in which lots of children guaranteed labor and perpetuation.
I say all this breezily, but you have to understand how long it all took. I told you that Stonehenge was built 3,800 years ago. Now the first stone tools go back 2.5 million years. The first stand-up creatures about our own size appear 1.6 million years ago. The first flaked flints appear 100,000 years after that. The first burials go back 70,000 years. And then at around 10,000 BC, we finally reach the Neolithic or New Stone Age, when our journey really begins. Neolithic societies and families depended on fertility and security, but both of these were very precarious indeed. Stone Age agriculture goes with warfare. It goes with endless raids and counter-raids for the neighbor's crops, for the neighbor's pigs. And so these people were never free from fear. Fear of thieves, of raiders, of evil spirits, of nature, you name it. And the rituals to protect them from danger, to secure good hunting, good crops, success in battle, these rituals were crucial. And so these people developed increasingly complex magic techniques, most of which involved human sacrifices. They established their property and their welfare on heaps of human corpses.
Very few religions have ever done without sacrifices. And human sacrifice, with its terrifying emotional impact, enhances the power of religion to shape our imagination. In due course, more sophisticated religions were going to substitute animals for humans. But this kind of cut-rate salvation would have seemed quite useless in the late Stone Age. The paradox is that all these sacrifices were intended to help the forces of life, as symbolized by this earth goddess. Stone Age peasants worshipped the forces of nature, ever burgeoning, ever dying, ever renewed, and in this preoccupation with fertility, we find the origins of religion, kingship, political institutions, and basic social patterns. We don't know how this worked, but it may be that once humans had figured out the relationship between sexual intercourse and childbearing, they created rituals based on the sexual act. Rituals which they hoped would bring about the fertility of nature.
In many prehistoric rituals, a male impersonated the seed and so assumed the role of leader. He became what the ancient Britons called the grain king. At first, he was killed and buried, planted really, and replaced by a young and vigorous successor, and the people who acted this out, in whom the forces of nature were thought to be incarnated, these people were seen as gods and goddesses, or as something very close to gods and goddesses. But eventually society was persuaded that the grain king's death could be made just as magically effective by going through the motions, by symbolism. And when that happened, then the grain king was on his way to becoming a real king as well. And this transition would be facilitated if he was also the war chief of the clan.
We're not sure if this is the way it really happened, but we do know that real kings in Egypt and Mesopotamia did perform many of the functions in fertility rituals that I attributed to the grain king. In the earliest societies, it's possible to speculate that women might be worshipped as the creators of life. But while the reproductive power of woman is recognized in mythologies and rituals, the position of women in agricultural societies was far less free and equal than it was in hunting societies. And this was probably accentuated by a new tool that made it easier to grow crops, the ox-drawn plow. Because it required considerable strength, the plow was generally used by men. Women were left to do almost everything else, with most of the drudgery and practically no status, because men spent most of their time raiding or looking out for raiders. Agriculture and husbandry, religion and war would henceforth be the enduring benchmarks of human experience, the former to produce a subsistence and a small surplus, the latter to confiscate and consume them. Again, the details are rather vague. But we do know that early societies which left records were patriarchal, and so were their religions. And we know that these religions had priests. If magic was essential to make crops grow and cattle prosper, if fertility and healing and preservation from danger were thought to benefit the whole community, then the community would contribute to the upkeep of these specialists. And with these magicians and priests, we get the first economic class not directly engaged in producing its own food. In time, other such classes would appear: potters, miners, and craftsmen who work copper or other metals.
All of this implies two things. One, that the economy was capable of producing a surplus. Two, that things were getting more complicated, that not everybody was self-sufficient anymore, which in turn led to trade with further specialization, further surpluses, markets where surpluses were exchanged, and eventually bigger settlements not directly connected with agriculture, which we call cities and towns. And then this economic differentiation would produce a social differentiation.
Society would then divide into the rich, nobles and freemen, and the poor, dependents and slaves, with the rich having most of the land, becoming lords over the others. These lords fought among themselves because, being human, they wanted to dominate or to despoil one another. Then, as now, greed and revenge seem to dominate what you might loosely call political activity. And so men joined under the authority of the strongest, or were forced to join, and a landowning system developed which lasted thousands of years and which looks very much like the feudal system of the Middle Ages, where one man holds his land from another and owes him payment and service in return.
This sort of evolution was general. We find it in India, in China, in the Near East, and also at a later time, but in similar circumstances, in Europe. But it would be most early and most marked in areas where people were thickest on the ground, where the struggle for land was most intense, where organization for production, for defense, was most important. And these conditions were to be found in the area that we know today as the Fertile Crescent, that small portion of Asia and Africa that runs from Mesopotamia and Syria in the east to Egypt in the west. As we shall see in our next program, the ancient Egyptians.
A fertile desert, gigantic tombs, a religion dedicated to immortality, and a ruler who made sure the sun rose each day. Why did this civilization last longer than any other? An extraordinary 3,000 years. The ancient Egyptians, this time on the Western tradition.
The Western tradition really begins in the east. That's where the sun rises. That's where the first civilizations arise from which ours would grow. That's where we find the Fertile Crescent, which some books still describe as the cradle of civilization, and which, as you can see, is a rather small portion of Asia and Africa that runs from Mesopotamia and Syria to Egypt. But the importance of this little bit of land can hardly be overstated. Many of the things that we take for granted today had their roots here thousands of years ago, from the money in our pockets to our attitudes towards immortality. It's a paradox, but most of the so-called Fertile Crescent is relatively arid. About 5,000 years ago, the first permanent urban settlements were found only beside a river or by one of the springs that didn't dry up in the summer.
On the other hand, the three main rivers, the Tigris, the Euphrates, and the Nile, frequently overflow their banks and turn the valleys into marshland. So agriculture was largely dependent on flood control and on irrigation. First you needed to drain the land, then you needed to keep it watered. But if you did all that, you had tremendously rich soil which could bear regular crops not just once, but several times a year. So the land promised a lot, but it also imposed special conditions on the people who worked it. The ancient Egyptians often depicted the Nile and their relationship to it on wall paintings like this one. Digging irrigation channels and keeping them up are social tasks, even more than building walls to defend a village. And the more critical these social tasks are, the more tightly knit the society must be to carry them out. Here we see men measuring a field for planting. The control of water in the Fertile Crescent also provided society with a very powerful sanction. People who did not conform could be excluded from water. In a temperate climate like that of Europe, there's usually plenty of water, and this sort of exclusion is not tragic. But in an arid zone, you can die of it. And this also helps to explain the early degree of organization among communities in the region.
One of the best organized civilizations in the Crescent, though not necessarily the earliest, was to be found in Egypt, a place that I might best describe as an oasis in the desert. This relative isolation gave Egypt more unity than its neighbors and helped to make ancient Egyptians secure, stable, complacent, and very different from us. We are dynamic, aggressive, curious, interested in change and novelty and progress. The Egyptians were relatively passive. They did not think much about progress. They were more interested in stability, regularity, repetition, conservation. This allowed their culture to survive intact an extraordinary 3,000 years. For the ancient Egyptians, as for so many other peoples, geography was destiny. The Nile alone made life possible in the desert that surrounded it, as you can see in this scene of fishermen. It was about 10,000 years ago that the native population in what was then the Nile swampy valley switched from hunting and fishing to sowing crops. Over thousands of years, they figured out how to drain some of the swamps, turn them into farmland, harness the river water. So the Great Nile served as a lifeline to the Egyptians and also provided the need for cooperative effort and an organized way of life. And this led to a number of crucial developments sometime before 3000 BC. Astronomical charts and a calendar so you could keep track of seasonal regularities for your crops, and writing to record all this information. The Egyptians used a kind of pictorial writing called hieroglyphics. Each image, each hieroglyph, originally stood for a word. This, for instance, is the sign for cattle. The Egyptians also used signs to represent a sound or a letter. These symbols represent the sounds B, H, and Z. And the word Behez means calf. But because the Egyptians were such a literal people, they always wanted to use pictures next to the symbols. Eventually, they found something a little more practical to write on. A paper-like material which was made from the papyrus plant that grows all over the Nile Delta. The graceful fan of the papyrus reeds would then come to suggest the basic design of the typical Egyptian column, or at least of its capitals, which you can see today in their ruined temples. And so Egyptian culture was shaped by its environment in 100 different ways. When you look at the map, for instance, you can see that although the Nile Valley is very long, it's only 7 miles wide, an oasis between two burning deserts. Because Egypt is compact and surrounded by desert, it's defensible against attack. And because of the Nile, it is predictable. So the river supports a static society where life is pretty secure and reasonably happy if we can judge by the confident tone of early documents. But above the Nile, there stands an even more powerful force, and that is the sun. The sun which perfects what the river started, and which burns so fiercely that it appears divine. As an Egyptologist has put it, the Nile demands that men coordinate their efforts. The sun reveals to them that a single power rules the world. This symbiosis between sun and river valley is reproduced in the two most important gods of Egypt, Ra and Osiris. Ra is the sun and the begetter of the gods themselves, the creator of life and order, both human and divine. Osiris is the earth, the god of fertilizing water and of vegetation. He is also, as shown here, the god of death and resurrection. Osiris also has a wicked brother named Seth, who stands for all arid and unpleasant things, the desert, the night, the foreigner, disorder, and warfare. For the Egyptians, the struggle between Seth and Osiris symbolizes the cosmic drama, the cycle of death after life and life after death. Meanwhile, down in the valley, there's a man who is part god and part king. He is the pharaoh, named after the great house, the Pharaoh, in which he held court. From the first warrior prince who called himself pharaoh around 3000 BC,
To Cleopatra, the last Egyptian queen who died 30 years before Christ, Egypt counted 31 separate dynasties of pharaohs. To the Egyptians, it was Pharaoh who made sure the sun was going to rise by journeying through the night, symbolized by this leopard, and arriving safely at dawn. It was Pharaoh who guaranteed the harvest by being the first to wield a ceremonial hoe. And it was Pharaoh who threw a written order into the Nile as to when the flood should come. Luckily for him, it came so regularly that his command was invariably obeyed.
If Pharaoh was a god, he was also the state. He owned everything his people owned, and he even owned the people themselves. All officials acted in his name, all held their offices subject to his divine pleasure. Law was not codified, it was based on custom, and it was held to be simply the king's word, his personal interpretation of divine will and divine justice. You could not codify these decisions because every one of them was right for its particular moment and circumstances. And besides, once you wrote down a law, it acquired an impersonal authority of its own, an authority that might compete with the authority of the divine being whose will and whim alone could be the law.
Only Pharaoh expressed the ultimate truth and justice and goodness and cosmic force of harmony and order that the Egyptians called Maat. Here we see the final judgment of a dead man whose heart is being weighed against a feather from the goddess of truth and right. The power of Pharaoh was so absolute, in fact, that he not only controlled the laws of life on earth, but also access to eternity. Only he could be sure of a blessed afterlife going on forever. The only others who could even hope for eternal life were his family and those who went along to serve them in the hereafter. The pyramids indicate just how important a pharaoh's funeral arrangements were. One pharaoh after another built ever more monumental tombs. The very first pyramid was built at Saqqara during the Third Dynasty, and it may well be the first example of stone architecture in history. Alongside the pyramid, one can still see the smaller tomb of a nobleman. Eventually, it was felt that if a noble could be buried close to the royal tomb, and if he could carve or paint his titles on his own tomb, explaining how he had served Pharaoh in the past, how he could serve him in the life to come, then he might have a chance of being taken along. Better still, of course, was to get your effigy right into the royal tomb, like this high official of Queen Hatshepsut, who had his portrait carved behind the doors of her temple so he could enter eternity with her. The climax of this funerary obsession came about 2600 BC with the pyramids of the Fourth Dynasty, and especially with the Great Pyramid of Cheops at Giza, just north of the capital, which was then at Memphis. The Great Pyramid is nearly 500 feet high, and it contains nearly 2.5 million blocks of limestone, most of them 2 or 3 tons apiece, but some of them as much as 15 tons. Napoleon once sat down in its shade and calculated that the mass of stone above him would build a wall around France 10 feet high and 1 foot thick. All of these stones were hauled up and put together with the most extraordinary accuracy by the muscle power of conscript labor. The laborers were put in work camps during the summer months when the river covered their fields and when the flooded surface offered a convenient transit for the stones from quarries on one bank to pyramids on the other. The Sphinx nearby is also monumental, 240 feet long by 66 feet high, but at least it didn't have to be hauled in, it was carved out of a rock that happened to be there. The most imitable of Egyptian monuments, however, were the obelisks, tapered pillars, each carved out of a single block of granite between 70 and 100 feet tall. Today you can see them in the capitals of Europe, and of course in Washington, where as usual, Americans have improved on the original and made it 5 times larger. Like the pyramids, obelisks represent and symbolize the shining cone of the sun's rays, and also man's aspirations to immortality, to oneness with the gods. But effort involved in building these monuments couldn't be kept up for long. The drain on the country's manpower and resources was too heavy. Between 2500 and 2300 BC, the kings of the 5th and 6th dynasties built much smaller pyramids. And this decline in size was matched by a shrinking in the king's position and the concomitant rise of the priests and nobles. Egyptian culture flowered brilliantly during this time. Trade expeditions went abroad to Lebanon for cedar, to Crete for olive oil, and into the desert to mine copper, and the whole nation moved forward economically and intellectually in the first 4 dynasties. At first, all this redounded to the greater power and glory of the pharaoh. But as the state became more powerful and effective, the pharaoh had to have a larger number of servants. Government became more elaborate, offices increased, and officials who were sent out far from the capital found themselves increasingly on their own. They were supposed to exercise the will of the king, but actually they exercised independent judgment.
And so, ironically, the centralizing forces of royal absolutism, trying to expand and control more and more, built up a decentralizing counteraction of individualism. When royal officials were successful in carrying out the pharaoh's commands, they were granted hereditary lands and perhaps even hereditary right to the offices they held. And as their wealth and position became more secure, the officials became less dependent on Pharaoh in this life and the next.
Meanwhile, the great funerary foundations around the royal tombs, which were endowed with land to keep the priests praying and the dead kings happy, these great cities of death were not only using up important resources while they were being built, but their upkeep continued to eat up the land even after they were finished and their builder buried. So much of Egypt was bestowed on temples and tombs that the numbers and wealth of the priests rose dramatically. And at the same time, the pharaohs were parting with a lot of their land, which was the source of their wealth. As the wealth and power of the pharaohs decreased, there was more decentralization, both political and magical. In 2600 BC, in the 4th dynasty, and then in the 5th, the tombs of the nobles had clustered around the tombs of the king. By 2300 BC and the 6th dynasty, a lot of the nobles, like this one, built their tombs at home in the provinces. They and the priests and the high government officials became confident that they had a good chance of eternal life on their own. They didn't have to bother Pharaoh. They didn't have to bother with Pharaoh. Not only could they build for eternity, but they could also interpret Mat, the justice and truth that was once administered by the Pharaoh alone.
And so the 6th dynasty ends in 2200 BC, and along with it, there ends the period known as the Old Kingdom. For 2 centuries afterwards, the decentralization of Egypt's failing kings brings fragmentation and anarchy, with nobles and princes squabbling for supremacy. The so-called Middle Kingdom begins when a new dynasty of pharaohs restores order, but it too has a structural weakness. The pharaoh's word is no longer law. Laws begin to be written down, and Pharaoh himself is accepted only as long as he is powerful and alert. With the increasing independence of the nobles, it's only a matter of time before the royal family loses its grip. We get another period of war, disunity and disorder between the 1700s and 1500s BC, but this time foreigners from the northeast break in, warlike peoples much better armed than the Egyptians, with horses and chariots and stronger bows. These are the Hyksos, the shepherd kings from Asia. Egypt was no longer an oasis now, but a battlefield. For the first time, part of its territory was conquered by foreigners. The deep sense of security from attack, which had been the cornerstone of the Egyptian system, was fractured. When the foreigner was finally cast out in the 16th century before Christ, he was succeeded by great warrior pharaohs whose heroic efforts are pictured in many wall carvings. Under this new kingdom, Egypt was going to have more periods of glory and more years of peace, roughly from the 1500s to 1000 BC. Obviously, things weren't too bad, because it's from this period that some very charming paintings survive of people hunting and banqueting, and in one of the banquet scenes, an old blind harpist sings a song which, like all good things in Egypt, is an old song, but one which would continue to be sung for a long time, and this is how the song ends. Spend a happy day, rejoice in the sweetest perfumes. Adorn the neck and arms of your wife with lotus flowers, and keep your loved one seated always at your side. Call no halt to music and dance, but bid all care be gone. Spare thought for nothing but pleasure, for soon your turn will come to journey to the land of silence. This was nice, but the Egyptians never forgot the Hyksos humiliation, and they became nervous and insecure. The new kingdom was faced with new invasions, and a powerful class of professional soldiers and administrators came to run the country, along with the omnipresent priests. By this time, the power of the divine kings had become a facade for a stiff, formalistic hierarchy and bureaucracy based less on tradition and custom than on rules and laws, less on might than on formal discipline and pietism. Unfortunately for the new kingdom, the Egyptians would rather enjoy life than fight. Military service was always unpopular, and armament was frequently backward. So whenever the Egyptians clashed with strong armies, they usually lost, which is what we see happening in the 1000 years before Christ. After Egypt was last conquered in 330 BC by Alexander the Great, it was ruled by the Ptolemies, descendants of one of Alexander's generals, until the last dynasty came to an inglorious end with the suicide of Cleopatra and colonization by Rome. But the most fascinating thing is that all this time the image of Pharaoh remained the same. The Egyptian ideal, the conventional style and models established 3,000 years before, these endured longer than anything in the Western world. And yet, while the form persisted, the substance changed. The relative security and serenity of the Egyptians had cracked. The song of the harper continued to be sung, but its words didn't mean anything anymore, or else they referred to a golden age long ago and far away. In our next program, we shall return to the Fertile Crescent to examine the Mesopotamians, who are as similar to us as the Egyptians were different. It was an oasis, a garden between two of God's rivers, a place of fantastic gods, sacred surrealism, and ruthless pragmatism. A place where we can find our origins, laws, trade, money, and bloodshed on a lavish scale. Mesopotamia, this time on the Western tradition. Now see if you can recognize this passage. And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight or good for food. And a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted and became into 4 heads. The name of the first is Pison. The name of the second is Gihon. The name of the third river is Hiddekel. That it is which goeth towards the east of Assyria. We call it the Tigris. And the fourth river is Euphrates. Now, of course, this is a passage from the book of Genesis. And it reproduces the image of the garden, an oasis between God's third and fourth rivers. The garden where the first men lived with the animals in the midst of a generous nature that posed no problems. Yet, it was paradise. And paradise is another name for a garden. And this paradise was ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. But Mesopotamia and the lands around it, from the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf, from the Iranian plateau to the Mediterranean, were a paradise in the shadow of natural disasters, just as the Garden of Eden was paradise in the shadow of the fall. The region had torrential rains like these. The Egyptians talked about a Nile in the sky. It had hurricanes, terrible sandstorms, uncontrollable floods, as we know from the story of the Great Flood, which the Israelites got from a Babylonian epic. And when nature was making life hard and unpredictable, people were with fire and sword. The Nile Valley in Egypt was never a highway for invaders. The sea lay at one end, unorganized savages at the other, so Egypt was able to develop its civilization without continuous warfare. But the Tigris and the Euphrates are great natural highways, not only for trade, but also for the movement of armies and the migrations of peoples. And so the Mesopotamians were both soldiers and traders. Their realism, their cruelty, their ruthlessness can be explained in part by their geographical circumstances, and so can their gods. Terrible, unpredictable, and likely to manifest themselves in unpleasant ways. The beginnings of a great many things we use today can be found in a small area, no bigger than Denmark, on the Tigris-Euphrates delta, which we know as Sumer.
Even their endless wars, especially their wars, sparked technological innovations and spurred social, cultural, and economic change. It was in Sumer, through drainage and irrigation, that the first villages of reed huts and adobe became cities by the 4th millennium BC. The founders of this first Mesopotamian civilization were called Sumerians. It's in this general area that we think the wheel first appeared, adapted from the potter's wheel and replacing the sledges that were used to transport heavy loads. Around 2000 BC, someone invented spokes, which made the wheel much lighter, and later still the axle was invented, and so people in the Near East were the first to hunt and make war in chariots, which gave them a significant advantage.
By the time history begins, that is, by the time we start to have written records around 3000 BC, we find not only cities in Sumer, but also vast temples and a complicated social structure headed by priests. The social cement is provided not by a river and its water, as in Egypt, but by the temple, which rules and dominates the community, which dominates the countryside, and around which a city grows. The construction of a temple was a cooperative task. The labor of hundreds of people who took part had to be coordinated, had to be directed. Everything had to be planned accurately in advance. And as a matter of fact, the outlines of a temple, a building, were laid out with string before work started on the walls.
And we have temple plans from various cities drawn to scale on clay tablets. The Sumerians believed that such plans were designed by the gods themselves and revealed in dreams. But the real architects were presumably the priests. Another thing we find connected with the temples are clay tablets scratched with shorthand pictures and with numerals. These are accounts kept by the priests who were the administrators of the temple estates and who had to give account for their stewardship to the gods, more probably to their colleagues. So they agreed on a conventional method of recording receipts and expenses in written signs that their colleagues and successors would understand. In other words, they invented writing. And writing, as the Mesopotamians developed it, reflects one of the chief differences between them and the Egyptians, their capacity for and inclination to abstraction. The Egyptian hieroglyph, remember, is an image, a picture. The Egyptians were a very literal people, so even though they used signs to represent a sound or a syllable, they always wanted to use pictures as well. Even the alphabetic signs are not simply abstract letters, but little pictures in their own right. But then the successors to the Sumerians, the Semites, went one step further. The Semites were a people who moved from the Arabian desert to Mesopotamia in the 3rd millennium and soon absorbed Sumerian culture. It was they who combined the alphabetic and pictorial forms of writing into a single system with abstract signs replacing literal pictures. Many Sumerian statues also tend to be abstract. And Mesopotamians were good at mathematics too, where Egyptians were much more literal and concrete. This is a clay tablet of math problems for Mesopotamian students. In religion, there were differences as well. Egyptian society claimed to imitate the divine, but in effect it invented a divine world which was the double of the real one, only much grander and finer. This is something we shall find also in ancient Greece. The Semites, on the other hand, invented a divine world which was peculiar to itself and separate in its divinity. They deliberately used a sort of sacred surrealism to move away from realism, emphasizing the fantastic aspect of their gods, their great hypnotic eyes, their non-human attributes. You might say that where the Egyptians tried to capture the difference between the human and the divine by enlarging the scale of things, that is, by making bigger tombs and statues and images, the Semites appealed to equality, to mystery and fantasy and essence.
Mesopotamian temples and religious life clearly reflected this tendency to abstraction. But they also helped to create abstraction and to structure it. And that is because Mesopotamian life and society focused on serving the temple, the gods, the priests, at least in the beginning. But temples and temple servants did not exist in isolation. For one thing, the Sumerian city needed imports, timber, stone for building, metals for tools and weapon, and then gifts for the gods, precious stones from Afghanistan and India, mother of pearl from the Persian Gulf. And so you get trade that is extensive and active, and you get the rise of an independent and very mixed merchant class.
The armed caravans and merchant ships of the time were a potent agent in the diffusion of culture. Free craftsmen might travel with the caravans looking for a market for their skill. Slaves would form part of the merchandise because defeated enemies could be more useful alive than dead. And these slaves, together with the personnel of the caravan or the crew of the ship, would have to be accommodated in various cities. Foreigners in a strange land would then demand the comforts of their own religion, just as there is an American church in Paris today. And useful arts and crafts could be diffused just as easily. The socketed axe of Mesopotamian craftsmen, for example, was a great improvement on the old model, which was bound with cords. Their axes traveled to the Black Sea and to Troy. Their fast-spinning potter's wheels, which turned out jars like this one, went east to India and west to Greece and Egypt. And Egypt also adopted Mesopotamian glass-making techniques 1,000 years after they were first developed, around 2500 BC. Most important perhaps, metal workers from Mesopotamia and from Anatolia to the north found out how to use furnaces to smelt metal ores. Copper in the 4th millennium, bronze in the 3rd, and iron in the 2nd. This gave the region beautiful new objects, but also tools of war like this helmet. Stronger metals make for better arms, and a lead over your neighbors in war, and a lead in trade as well, because anything you make better than your neighbors, you can sell. Trade also made the population of the Sumerian cities more mixed, because merchants moved, craftsmen moved, and slaves moved from place to place, so the blood principle of the earlier societies, that all its members were descended from a common ancestor, this became more and more of a fiction. As a result, the hold of the temple on the city was loosened, and the god or goddess ruling through the high priest was replaced by a secular governor or king like this one, who ruled in the name of the god. You may think that this is a subtle distinction, but it's the first step towards secular power, not sacred, not priestly, but power wielded by laymen. Although these secular rulers ended by claiming they were almost gods themselves, they were primarily regarded as representatives of the god delegated to carry out his or her will. When they fought, it was the god who directed their arms and really fought the battle, which meant that victory in battle confirmed the king's divine commission. And when they legislated, they simply interpreted and applied the rules that the god had told them he wanted men to follow.
Whereas in Egypt, justice was an aspect of the divine order of which Pharaoh was an inseparable part, in Mesopotamia, as in Israel, justice was an expression of God's commands, of God's will, written down by a man whom God had trusted the way he trusted Moses, for example. And so the divine creator of the law and the communicator of the law were no longer one and the same. And with this separation, the law took on a life of its own. A written law, for instance, was a two-sided contract. The subject had to obey the king, had to obey the king's law, but the king was supposed to abide by his own law, by the same law. And so no one was above the law, at least in theory. And while the theory was often ignored, and still is today, it was a basic principle with great power in the long run because it was respected even in the breach. And so this writing down and codification of the law was going to affect political life and political ideas down through the ages.
For the moment, however, Mesopotamian kings were mostly warlords, and that was a task that must have kept them fairly busy because war played a major part in the life of these ancient societies. Although these peasants produced a surplus, it was concentrated in the hands of a relatively small number of people. This limited the opportunities of an expanding rural population, so the poor peasants had to find new lands to till. The Sumerian cities sponsored reclamation works both against the desert and the swamp, but then as now, the most effective labor-saving device was stealing. So there were endless wars between cities, one trying to seize or recapture another's land. Eventually, a straightforward imperialism would develop from this warfare. Some city or region would extend its power even further, eliminating all the competition around it and establishing its rule and that of its god over all the others.
So, over the centuries, beginning about 2400 BC, you have a series of empires, first dominated by Sumerian cities like Ur or Lagash, then by cities further north, like Akkad of the Semites, the exact location of which is still unknown, eventually by Babylon, the capital of a Semitic people, the Amorites.
Babylon was the greatest commercial city in the area. There were an incredible number of languages and dialects babbled in its streets and markets, which inspired the legend of the Tower of Babel or Babel, although the prototypical step temple or ziggurat had been created by the Sumerians. Around 1800 BC, the king of Babylon, Hammurabi, on the right, gave his subjects a written code of law, public and private. Hammurabi's code, carved here on a monument, became the basis of international commercial law, regulating contracts, interests, forms of mortgage, and every kind of commercial transaction. It also covered criminal cases, and rather severely at that. Law number 8. If a man has stolen ox or sheep, or ass or pig or ship, whether from the temple or the palace, he shall pay 30-fold. If he stole from a commoner, he shall render 10-fold. If the thief cannot pay, he shall be put to death. Law number 110. If a nun, a lady of God who is not living in a convent, has opened the door of a wine shop or entered the wine shop for a drink, that woman shall be burnt. Law number 196. If a man has caused the loss of a gentleman's eye, they shall cause him to lose one eye.
So Mesopotamian civilization was the first to develop things that we take for granted today, including the idea of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Both their laws and their standardized writing, which preserved the laws, came out of business practices because they had to write their agreements down and they had to enforce these agreements. And it was the Sumerians who also developed weights and measures, which were necessary for trade and extremely useful for keeping temple accounts and for building public works. And meanwhile, the organized cooperation of an urban population required more accurate divisions of time than you needed in a village. And so the Sumerians divided day and night into 12 double hours, hence our 24 hours, and they devised instruments to measure these intervals. They and the Babylonians also divided the year into weeks of 7 days, an idea which the Jews were later to borrow and then we're going to improve upon by introducing one weekly day of rest. And then finally, the Sumerians and their cousins upriver invented a measure that we call money. By that time, the exchange of goods and services had come to play a really important part in the new economy, and a common standard was needed so that different kinds of goods could be measured, could be valued.
What was a cow worth after all? Or a pot? Or a slave? And this conventional standard of value would also serve as a medium of exchange in which you could purchase commodities and reward services, that is, pay wages. The first standard so used was apparently barley, which was the staff of life. In fact, wages and rents would be paid most frequently in measures of barley for a couple of thousand years, even in Hammurabi's time, about 1800 to 1700 BC. But by then metal, that is silver and for small sums copper, was being recognized as the most convenient medium for exchange. In the 8th century BC, Assyrian kings began to stamp silver bars, and in the 7th century BC, Lydian kings began to make coins like this one. But in the beginning, the units of silver or copper used for exchange were not coins, but quantities of metal that you would weigh out, which was a bit awkward.
Still, the adoption of a conventional metallic standard marks the transition from a natural economy in which objects were bartered to a money economy in which everything could be priced at so many shekels of silver or so many gers of barley. And one result of this was that you could estimate wealth not in foodstuffs or in slaves or in commodities that can themselves be consumed, used, enjoyed, but in terms of a general abstract medium which cannot itself be consumed, but which can be exchanged for any consumable commodity or any useful service. And so the producers could consider working just for the market rather than for themselves or for one particular person who ordered something and offered a particular commodity in return. You could produce for the market, and you could take the price that you got in the market and you could put it away and use it to get something that you might want another time. Moreover, the new generalized wealth possessed the same property that wheat and barley and cattle had. It could reproduce itself. It could multiply itself. Like grain, like livestock, money could be treated as capital and could be used to secure an increase, to become a profit. And if you lent it, you could charge interest. So that by the time Hammurabi came along 3,800 years ago, he really had something to legislate about, as we shall see in our next program.
Ancient Assyria, Babylon, Persia, out of their bloody wars our civilization grew. As one empire gave way to another, trade and culture spread, barbarians were tamed, and new cities were founded around the Mediterranean. From bronze to iron, this time on the Western tradition.
Last time, you may recall, I ended on a subject dear to the heart of many of us, money. There was growing prosperity in Mesopotamia among the merchants and also among the temples which filled their treasuries and put the money out to rent. In other words, they acted rather like banks. And yet this new wealth benefited only a small part of the population, and oddly enough, one of the major factors in spreading the wealth and breaking up the rather stifling institutions of the third millennium were the great plundering wars in which the kings of Akkad and later of Babylon and Nineveh distinguished themselves. It was war, not peace, that spurred the greatest social changes.
Some of the booty these kings fought for consisted of the jewels and ores they either could not or would not buy from savage tribes or from other foreigners. The Egyptians used to send armed expeditions to extract the copper ores in the Sinai desert. In the same way, Sumerians, and more especially the Semitic kings in Akkad and Babylon, sent expeditions north and west to get the raw materials they couldn't do without: metals, stone, timber. The plundering wars of kings like Sargon of Assyria around 1850 BC also shed tremendous quantities of blood. And if you read the annals of the kings of Assyria in northern Mesopotamia, you find them awash with pride and blood and gore. Cities are taken and plundered and burnt, captives are flayed or impaled alive, and heads, hands and feet are cut off in what sounds like industrial quantities. But between the rapes and murders and humiliations, there are also long lists of plunder: silver and gold and metals and crops and cattle and slaves. There is one revealing passage from the Assyrian king Assurbanipal of the 7th century BC who boasts, "The people, the asses, camels, sheep, I carried away as spoils to Assyria." When Assurbanipal distributed the camels and sheep to his people, there were so many that they came down in price until they were a drag on the market. As the king tells us, tavern keepers got camels, slaves received camels, brewers for a drink of beer, and gardeners for a basket of fresh dates.
And so the forcible distribution of conquered wealth that had been hoarded in treasuries spread purchasing power throughout Mesopotamia. And this stimulated demand and it stimulated production, while at the same time war captives swelled the supply of slaves and of available skills. The merchants who then contracted to dispose of the loot and the tribute, these merchants could make profits, and the staff of the merchants would benefit too. And so a distinct social group began to take shape that we might call a middle class, in between the warriors and priests on one side and the poor masses on the other. And the money economy spread until even land, no longer the sole property of God or king, even the land came to be bought and sold just like any other commodity.
And war also helped spread what we might call culture. The success of the Akkadian armies, for example, was due to their superior bronze weapons and their superior armor. If you wanted to resist the Akkadians, you had to manufacture similar armaments, you had to find smiths and supply them with raw materials, you had to organize trade. So the imperialism of societies like those in Mesopotamia either conquered and assimilated, or else generated resistance. And resistance in turn generated Bronze Age economies which were dependent on trade and which were as close to those of the aggressor as the resistors could possibly make them. It's possible, in fact, to argue that technological and economic improvements throughout history followed less the plow than the war chariot. And what was true in the early Bronze Age, around 2400 BC, seems to be equally true of the period of anarchy several hundred years later, when one barbarian dynasty succeeded another in Babylon, and nobody's property or life was safe from the endless raids and wars of the time. What happened in those circumstances was that the pillaging of the countryside and the disruption of the great estates emphasized the value of incorruptible and much more mobile metal wealth as compared to the real but perishable wealth produced by the land. It was easier to safeguard a bag full of silver than a field full of barley.
During this period, the natural economy collapsed in anarchy over and over again. And this too encouraged the spread of the money economy. And as the money economy spread, or at least exchanges spread, production for the market became increasingly common. Businessmen realized that they could go in for speculative imports of cargoes of this or that to sell in the market, and that they could make better profits this way than by working on commission to get specific articles that a state or a temple might order.
This was so in part because there were more people buying in the market. In Mesopotamia, as in Egypt, the end of the second millennium saw the rise of an army of literate officials, appointed by the state, ranging from junior clerks to judges, collecting taxes and fines and keeping accounts, and they got their incomes not just in kind, but in money too. They didn't have farms of their own. They couldn't produce their own necessities any more than the soldiers could who came back with captives and goods, and so all wound up as buyers in the bazaar. And there were also growing numbers of professional priests as the victorious rulers and the superstitious citizens endowed more and more temples and chantries. And these priests would go shopping too. So now craftsmen and peasants find a growing market for their products, like these jars, and they begin at last to get a larger share in the technical benefits of civilization beside an arrow in the back. Metal begins to spread to the countryside, and even Egyptian peasants now start to use tools made of metal. Around 15 or 1600 BC, iron was so rare that it was worth twice as much as gold. After 1200 BC, when they learned how to harden iron by carburation, it becomes increasingly affordable, and it provides better cutting tools, whether for shearing wool or castrating animals or humans. Because iron is cheaper to produce and more readily available than bronze, it democratizes agriculture and industry until around 800 or 900 BC. Cheap iron perfects the process that economic imperialism had started 1,000 years before. The peasants could finally afford iron axes and plowshares, the common artisan could own his own toolkit and be independent of temples or patrons, and the commoner could use iron weapons and meet Bronze Age knights like this one on better terms. Which also means that iron democratizes warfare. Poor and backward barbarians could now challenge the armies of civilized states, which until then possessed a monopoly of bronze armaments.
So once again, the interaction between war and technology becomes manifest. The Bronze Age collapses around the end of the second millennium, and we see the rise of great military empires which are able to fulfill the aims of earlier Mesopotamian powers by gathering in all the lands and the products that their poor native economies might need. And next, we get several centuries of blood and gore and chaos about which we can speak calmly because we weren't there. And then when we look again, we find that things have moved forward once more.
Between about 1000 and 500 BC, the zone of literate urban society had expanded far more than it had grown in the 15 centuries of the Bronze Age. The change was largely due to the great empires of Assyria and Neo-Babylon and Persia. Each of these empires unified tremendous territories under their rule, and even though they did this at frightful cost in human lives and wealth, the political unification they imposed promoted intercourse on an unprecedented scale over a wider area than ever before. As armies and slaves and skilled workers and traders moved all over these vast areas, they developed a lingua franca, a common speech, so they could make themselves understood wherever they went. It was a Syrian language from the region around Damascus, and it was called Aramaic. Aramaic had its own script with 22 letters, all consonants, as in most Semitic languages. It was then absorbed by the Chaldeans who ruled in Babylon, and later adopted as the official language of the Persian Empire around the 6th century BC. In the process, it replaced Hebrew as the language of some of the Old Testament texts, and it's probably what Jesus and his apostles spoke centuries later. The Assyrians, and still more the Persians, also built post roads to collect tribute more effectively, and these roads were used by soldiers and officials and couriers and merchants. By the 5th century BC, even people of modest means like Herodotus, the first professional travel writer, could afford to tour the backlands of Asia. The Assyrians and their Neo-Babylonian heirs were also forcibly transporting whole communities from one end of their empire to the other to make them less dangerous by getting them away from home. One unintended result of this was a very thorough pooling of peoples which made the big cities thoroughly cosmopolitan. The Assyrians brought disaster to, among other peoples, the Hebrews, who may have come from Ur in Mesopotamia, but who eventually settled to the west in Canaan by way of Egypt. The Hebrews established two kingdoms in Canaan. One was called Judah, with its capital at Jerusalem, and the other called Israel to the north. This northern kingdom was destroyed by the Assyrians in 722 BC. The Old Testament's book of Isaiah, which was probably written shortly after, describes what it must have been like. Your country lies desolate. Your cities are burnt with fire. In your very presence aliens devour your land. It is desolate as overthrown by aliens. And the daughter of Zion is left like a booth in a vineyard, like a lodge in a cucumber field, like a besieged city. In 586 BC, the Hebrew southern kingdom of Judah was also defeated, this time by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II. Thousands of captives were taken off to Babylon and enslaved. But the Hebrews were not the only people to be moved about in this way, and there were also many members of subject communities who were recruited for service in the imperial armies. In the 6th and 5th centuries BC, the kings of Persia hired archers from Central Asia and Indian chariot troops to fight along with Syrian levies and Greek mercenaries. And these people carried the germs of one culture to another, just as the caravans and the ships that moved about in increasing number through the vast, relatively pacified, relatively secure empires. The largest of these empires was established in the 6th century BC when Cyrus the Great of Persia made an alliance with Babylon and then led a rebellion against the Medes, who were the overlords of Persia. Through subsequent conquests, the Persian Empire spread from India to the Aegean Sea. The Persians were warrior horsemen ruling over a terribly disparate empire. As conquerors, the Persians and Medes were the privileged dominant race. Their king was not a god, rather the delegate of a god, the way local people were used to having, and the way the god designated him was characteristic. The particular warrior chief whose horse, a sacred animal, had been the first to neigh in salute to the rising sun, became king. Whether the great king was mortal or divine, his subject peoples still had to pay tribute, as you can see them doing on the walls in Persepolis, the Persian capital in present-day Iran. The Medes and Persians themselves, on the other hand, owed only military service. But as the empire expanded, there weren't enough Medes and Persians to go round. So the subject peoples had to serve as well, which meant they were forced to bear arms in defense of a state that kept them in servitude. So the Persians really couldn't rely on their loyalty, as they eventually found out.
Still, for a century or so, the Persian centralized bureaucratic state kept the peace, more or less, and that's nothing to scoff at. And the Persian peace helped to spread civilization from Asia Minor into the Mediterranean. There, in that great Midland Sea, a few hundred years before the birth of Christ, we find vigorous barbarians tamed by rubbing against Syrians, Phoenicians, Persians, Egyptians, barbarians who are going to create an intellectual and artistic renaissance which combines strength and a new vision with the technical skills that they learned from the older traditions of the Near East.
After the 9th century BC, the Phoenicians founded new cities around the Mediterranean, and after the 8th century BC, the Greeks founded theirs. But these cities were not established to be provincial capitals and garrison towns and tax-gathering centers for the central power as the Asian cities were. Instead, they were overseas settlements of emigrant farmers for whom there was no room in the narrow coastal plain of Phoenicia and the still narrower valleys of Greece. What these colonists wanted were new lands to till, new fishing grounds, new bases for piracy and commerce. So the Phoenicians colonized North Africa, and from there, fanning out from Carthage, they colonized western Sicily, Sardinia, the coasts of Spain. While the Greeks spread round the Black Sea and westward to eastern Sicily, southern Italy, and on to Marseille. Finally, there were the Etruscans, a people from Asia Minor who had probably learned civilization through mercenary service in the imperial armies of the East, and who established themselves as a ruling class among the Indo-European farmers in central Italy around Florence. The Etruscans imposed their kind of civilization on the barbarian natives, and they founded small cities as centers of an urban economy. But some of the people they conquered with great brutality were able to expel their alien masters and turn the weapons of civilization against their oppressors. And among these people, the most notable would be an obscure tribe or federation in south-central Italy called the Romans. At any rate, one thing the Greek and Phoenician colonists brought with them was a simplified form of writing using 22 signs to denote the consonants, which had been developed in some Canaanite or Phoenician city and which would become the parent of our modern script. With the alphabet to simplify things, reading and writing became as simple as they are today. Literacy ceased to be the mysterious privilege of a highly specialized class of priests and scribes. Administrators, engineers, medical men, merchants, even some soldiers were learning to read and write. By the 7th century BC, common mercenary soldiers, both Greek and Phoenician, were educated enough to scribble graffiti on their helmets. The Greeks then took this Phoenician script, converted some of the signs for peculiarly Semitic consonants, and invented a few more signs to express in Greek the vowel sounds that the Semites had ignored, but that you need in Indo-European languages. And it was apparently from Greek colonists in Italy that the Etruscans, and hence the Romans, learned how to read and write. Of course, those who did read were not very numerous, but their appearance meant that a new distinction would join and reinforce the old distinctions between rich and poor, high and low. Literacy created a barrier which has persisted ever since between the educated and the uneducated sections of society.
But literacy also provided a means of communication that could last through time, a means of communication which not only stabilized culture, but also allowed it to accumulate and grow by compound interest, because knowledge was no longer condemned to die with those who held it, or at best to be passed on, garbled by word of mouth. It could be recorded, preserved, assimilated by following generations, referred to, added to, summoned up at will, a treasury of memory and inspiration, or quite simply information. So here you have the beginnings of our world in the Middle East and in the Mediterranean. If you are looking for origins, You might say that our culture, our Western culture, is an Asian culture, and that the Western tradition has its roots in that great dust heap of history that runs from the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf. A dark and bloody ground that we never cease to recreate in our gods, in our wars, in our restlessness, but also in our inventiveness and enterprise and expansionism. And this is even truer of the Mediterranean, which is a kind of liquid history, around whose shores the old traditions were transmuted, and from whose shores they have irrigated the entire Western world, as we shall see in the programs ahead.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching. For information about this and other Annenberg CPB programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.